Millions of subjects traded gold coins, minted with his portrait, while official stamps bearing his name shifted borders and marched armies into war. Possessing the noblest blood in the empire and holding the power of life and death over 5 million citizens, he was King Otto I of Bavaria. Why did history insist on keeping this tragic madman, a man unaware of his own existence, seated upon the highest throne of the realm for 27 long years, while his older brother, the legendary Swan King, Ludwig II, is immortalized in popular culture for his fairy tale castles, his patronage of Richard Wagner, and his dramatic, mysterious death in Lake Starnberg? Otto is remembered, if at all, as a footnote. He is the mad brother, the placeholder, the shadow in the background of Ludwig's brilliance. But the story of Otto is not merely a medical case history or a dynastic curiosity. It is a deeply human tragedy of a promising life shattered by the visceral trauma of war, locked away in a gilded cage to preserve political stability. It is a story about the ruthless pragmatism of monarchies in the modern age, the terrifying fragility of the human mind, and the agonizing reality of a man erased from his own life. To understand the tragedy of Otto's end, one must first appreciate the immense weight of his beginning. He was not born broken. When Prince Otto Wilhelm Luitpold Adalbert Waldemar von Wittelsbach entered the world on April 27, 1848, in the Munich residence, he was born into a dynasty that was teetering on the brink of collapse. The year 1848 was the springtime of nations, a year of fire and revolution that swept across Europe, toppling governments and forcing monarchs to their knees. In Munich, the streets were barricaded. His grandfather, King Ludwig I, had been forced to abdicate just weeks before Otto's birth, humiliated by a scandalous affair with the dancer Lola Montes and the rising tide of liberal anger. Otto was born into this chaos, a child of the counter-revolution. He was the second son of the newly proclaimed King Maximilian II and Queen Marie of Prussia. His birth was a signal of continuity, a desperate hope that the House of Wittelsbach would survive the storm. Unlike his older brother Ludwig, who had been born 3 years earlier and was immediately burdened with the crushing expectation of the crown, Otto was the spare. In royal dynasties, the role of the second son is notoriously difficult to navigate. They are raised with the same staggering sense of entitlement, the same rigid education, and the same isolation as the heir, yet they are often denied a clear purpose. They are the backup plan, kept in reserve in case of tragedy. However, in the early years of the Bavarian court, it was Otto who seemed the more grounded, perhaps even the more capable of the two brothers. The contrast between them was evident almost from the cradle. Ludwig was a difficult birth, a difficult baby, and grew into a difficult child. Introspective, prone to tantrums, artistic, obsessed with myths, and painfully shy. Otto, by comparison, was the vibrant counterpoint. Contemporary accounts from nannies and tutors describe young Otto as cheerful, outgoing, and physically robust. He had an easy charm that his intense older brother lacked completely. If Ludwig was the brooding moonlight, Otto was the sunshine, a boy who laughed easily and engaged with the world around him rather than retreating from it. The brothers grew up in a strange, isolated world, shuttled between the imposing Munich residence and the neo-Gothic fantasy of Hohenschwangau Castle in the Bavarian Alps. Their parents were distant figures bound by the stiff etiquette of the 19th century court. King Maximilian II was a cerebral, intellectual man, a professor on the throne, who preferred the company of scientists and historians to that of his own children. He was often cold, critical, and demanding, viewing his sons primarily as vessels for the future of the state. Queen Marie, a Prussian princess, was more affectionate but ultimately bound by her duty to raise soldiers and statesmen, not children. She loved the mountains, a passion she passed on to both her sons, but she lacked the emotional depth to understand the complex psychologies developing within them. In this emotional vacuum, Ludwig and Otto formed an intensely close bond. They were each other's only true companions. They spent idyllic summers at Hohenschwangau, a castle steeped in the romantic legends of the Swan Knight Lohengrin, surrounded by dark forests and alpine lakes. Here, the hierarchy of their birth was suspended, if only briefly. They hiked for hours through the rugged terrain, swam in the freezing waters of the Alpsee, and enacted elaborate plays drawn from the Germanic myths their father loved. Yet even in play, Ludwig was always the dominant force. His imagination was vivid and overpowering, often dragging his younger brother into his elaborate fantasy worlds. Otto was the willing participant, the loyal lieutenant to Ludwig's king, learning early on that his role was to support, to follow, and to endure his brother's fluctuating moods. Their education was brutal. King Maximilian was determined to raise a modern intellectual monarch in Ludwig and a capable, disciplined support in Otto. The boys were woken before dawn. Their days were regimented down to the minute with lessons in French, Latin, Greek, mathematics, history, religion, and military tactics. Corporal punishment was common. There was no room for weakness, no room for nerves. For Otto, who was naturally more pragmatic and less dream-prone than Ludwig, this regime was harsh but manageable. He adapted. He learned to compartmentalize, but for Ludwig, it was torture, driving him further into his internal world. Otto often found himself acting as a buffer between his sensitive brother and their stern father, a role that forced him to mature quickly. As they entered adolescence, the divergence in their paths became physical as well as psychological. Ludwig grew tall, pale, and ethereal, with a beauty that was almost feminine. Otto grew into a handsome, masculine young man with a darker complexion and a soldier's bearing. While Ludwig began to sneak out at night to gaze at the moon and read poetry, Otto embraced the traditional outlet for a Bavarian prince, the military. In 1863, at the age of 15, Otto officially entered the Bavarian army as a sub-lieutenant. This was not merely a ceremonial posting, as was common in other European courts where princes wore uniforms, but never trained. The Bavarian military tradition demanded actual service. Otto took to the discipline and camaraderie of military life with genuine enthusiasm. It offered him something he had never found in the classroom or the palace: a clear structure, a tangible objective, and a sense of belonging. He was a skilled horseman, fearless in the saddle, and he enjoyed the rough humor and straightforward relationships of the barracks. For a time, it seemed Otto had found his place in the world. He was the practical Wittelsbach, the soldier prince who would command the armies while his brother managed the state, but the universe had other plans. On March 10, 1864, King Maximilian II died, suddenly after a short illness. He was only 52. The shock to the system was immense. Ludwig, just 18 years old and utterly unprepared for the realities of governance, was proclaimed King Ludwig II Otto. At 15, became the heir presumptive to the throne. The dynamic shifted overnight. Ludwig was no longer just the older brother. He was the sovereign, the anointed of God, the absolute ruler of 5 million people. Otto was now his subject. The intimacy of their childhood remained, but it was now warped by protocol and power. Ludwig moved into the royal apartments, surrounded by ministers and sycophants. Otto remained in the shadow, watching his brother struggle under the crushing weight of the crown. It was during these early years of Ludwig's reign that the first cracks in the family stability began to widen. Ludwig's behavior became increasingly erratic. He spent lavishly on opera, summoned Richard Wagner to Munich, and began to withdraw from public duties that bored him. The burden of representation, the parades, the balls, the opening of Parliament, often fell to Otto. The teenager was thrust into the spotlight, forced to be the charming face of the monarchy, while the king remained invisible. Otto performed these duties dutifully, smiling for the crowds, dancing with the debutantes, shaking hands with the diplomats. He was popular. The people of Munich loved the cheerful prince, who seemed so much more accessible than their strange, distant king. But beneath the surface, the pressure was mounting. Bavaria was a small kingdom trapped between two giants, the Austrian Empire to the south and the rising militaristic kingdom of Prussia to the north. The Prussian Prime Minister, Otto von Bismarck, was maneuvering to unify the German states under Prussian heel, and Bavaria was the primary obstacle to his ambition. The Wittelsbachs were desperate to maintain their independence, but they were playing a game they could not win. In 1866, the geopolitical chess match turned into blood. The Austro-Prussian War broke out. It was a conflict to decide the future of Germany. Bavaria, bound by heritage and religion, threw its lot in with Catholic Austria against Protestant Prussia. King Ludwig II was horrified by the prospect of war. He hated militarism, hated violence, and initially considered abdicating rather than signing the mobilization order. He retreated to his castles, refusing to lead his troops. So the duty fell to Otto. At just 18 years old, Prince Otto rode to war. He was not given a safe rear echelon position. He wanted to serve. He marched with the infantry, sleeping in the mud, eating the same rations, and waiting for the enemy. The War of 1866 was a shock to the entire European system. It was the first modern war in Central Europe, showcasing the terrifying efficiency of the Prussian needle gun and the industrialized logistics of the railway. The conflict was short, brutal, and decisive. It lasted only 7 weeks. Otto saw combat. He witnessed the reality of 19th century warfare, not the romantic charges of knights he had acted out at Hohenschwangau, but the mechanized slaughter of men in open fields. He saw bodies torn apart by artillery. He smelled the gangrene in the field hospitals, and he felt the humiliation of defeat. The Prussian war machine crushed the Austrian and Bavarian forces with terrifying speed. Bavaria was defeated. The kingdom was forced to pay a massive war indemnity to Prussia, essentially a ransom to keep its sovereignty. Worse, it was forced to sign a secret offensive-defensive alliance, pledging that in any future war, the Bavarian army would fall under the direct command of the King of Prussia. Otto returned from the front lines in 1866 physically unharmed, but psychologically marked. The cheerful boy was gone. In his place was a young man who had seen the fragility of his world. He had watched the army he loved, the symbol of Bavarian pride, shattered by the cold, gray efficiency of Prussia. He returned to Munich to find his brother Ludwig even more withdrawn. Depressed by the defeat and the loss of Bavarian prestige, Ludwig buried his shame in architecture, planning even grander castles. Otto had no such escape. He remained in the army, now a defeated army, training for a next war that everyone knew was coming. The years between 1866 and 1870 were a strange interlude. Otto threw himself into the libertine lifestyle of a young prince. There were rumors of affairs, of heavy drinking, of wild nights in Munich. It was the behavior of a man trying to outrun his memories, trying to numb a growing sense of dread. He was restless. He traveled, attempting to find some peace, but the shadow of Prussia loomed over everything. Bismarck was not finished. He needed one more war to complete his unification of Germany, a war against a common enemy that would bind the southern German states to Prussia forever. That enemy was France. In July 1870, the trap was sprung. France declared war on Prussia. Because of the secret treaty signed in 1866, Bavaria was legally obligated to join the fight. King Ludwig II was devastated. He was a Francophile, an admirer of Louis XIV, the Sun King. The idea of warring against France to serve Prussian ambition was repugnant to him, but he had no choice. The mobilization orders were signed. Once again, the king stayed home. Once again, Otto went to the front. This time, the trauma would be absolute. Otto was given command of the 5th Bavarian Jaeger Battalion. He was 22 years old. The Franco-Prussian War was not the quick skirmish of 1866. It was a grinding, brutal invasion. The campaign stretched through the summer and into a bitterly cold French winter. Otto was in the thick of it. He led his men through the battles of Worth and Sedan, engagements that saw casualties on a scale previously unimaginable. We have letters Otto wrote home during this period. They are not the letters of a glory-seeking prince. They are the writings of a man straining under the weight of horror. He wrote of the constant thunder of the cannons that made sleep impossible. He wrote of the endless marches through the mud, the freezing rain, the villages burning in the distance. He worried constantly about his men, the Bavarian sons who were dying for a cause that felt alien to them. He described the visceral disgust he felt at the sight of the dead piled like cordwood. "It is a slaughterhouse," he wrote to Ludwig. "There is no honor here, only death." But the war did not just break bodies. It broke the spirit of the Bavarian kingdom. As the German armies encircled Paris, Bismarck prepared his final stroke. He would proclaim the German Empire, the Deutsches Reich, uniting all German lands under the Prussian King Wilhelm I. The date was set, January 18th, 1871. The location, the Hall of Mirrors in the Palace of Versailles, the very heart of the French monarchy, the spiritual home of the absolute kings that Ludwig so admired, was to be the setting for the death of Bavarian independence. Bismarck demanded that the German princes attend to pay homage to the new emperor. It was a feudal ceremony in a modern age. King Ludwig II refused to go. He could not stomach the humiliation. He feigned illness, hiding in Hohenschwangau. He sent Otto in his place. This assignment was the final blow to Otto's stability. He was sent to Versailles not as a conqueror, but as a witness to his family's subjugation. He arrived in Versailles to find a scene of triumphalist Prussian arrogance. The palace was filled with the gray and blue uniforms of the Prussian officer corps. The air was thick with smoke and the sound of boots on marble. Otto's reaction to the proclamation of the German Empire was visceral. In a letter to Ludwig, written shortly after the ceremony, he poured out his heart. He described the event as ostentatious, hollow, and heartless. He described the pain of seeing their uncle, King Wilhelm of Prussia, proclaimed emperor, while the Bavarian dignitaries stood to the side, mere spectators in their own degradation. Everything was so cold, so proud, so glittering, and yet so empty, he wrote. He felt that by being there, by representing the Wittelsbach crown, he had betrayed their heritage. He had signed the death warrant of the Bavaria they loved. Contemporary observers at Versailles noted Otto's demeanor. He was not the dashing soldier of 1866. He looked gaunt, pale, and deeply disturbed. One report described him standing apart from the celebrations, his hands trembling, his eyes twitching nervously, staring at the floor while the cheers for the emperor rang out. He looked like a man who wanted to scream but had forgotten how. When Otto returned to Munich in early 1871, the change was undeniable. The physical exhaustion of the campaign was compounded by a deep, crushing melancholy. The sunshine had been extinguished. He had seen the industrial scale of death, and he had participated in the political funeral of his dynasty. He was 23 years old, but he carried the weariness of an old man. The family hoped that rest and a return to the peace of the Bavarian countryside would heal him. They hoped it was just battle fatigue, a temporary condition that would pass with time and good air. They were wrong. The darkness that had entered Otto's mind at Fürth, Sedan, and Versailles had taken root. It was not going to leave. It was going to grow slowly and malignantly until it consumed him entirely. The descent had begun. As the victorious armies disbanded and the celebratory smoke cleared from the streets of Munich, it quickly became apparent that the prince's condition was not merely temporary exhaustion. What had begun as melancholy on the battlefields of France was metastasizing into something far more dangerous in the quiet halls of the residence. The war was over, but for Otto the noise had simply moved inside his head. The return of Prince Otto to Munich in the spring of 1871 was greeted with the thunderous applause of a victorious nation, but the man who stepped off the train was a stranger to the cheering crowds. The capital was awash in the blue and white flags of Bavaria, intertwined with the black, white, and red of the new German Empire. Brass bands played martial tunes on every corner. Beer halls overflowed with veterans, recounting the glories of Sedan and the siege of Paris. For the average Bavarian citizen, this was a moment of complicated pride. They had bled, they had won, and they were now part of a mighty European superpower. But for Otto, the noise was a physical assault. The cheering sounded like screaming. The fireworks sounded like artillery. He moved through the victory parades like a mechanical doll, his eyes glazed, his smile a rictus of pained endurance. Those closest to the royal family noticed the change immediately. The Sunshine Prince, once the life of the court balls, had become a creature of the shadows. He retreated into his apartments at the Munich residence, ordering the heavy velvet curtains drawn tight against the day. He refused to see his former friends from the regiment. He refused to ride his beloved horses. The vibrant, athletic young man who had once swum across alpine lakes now spent days sitting in a darkened room, chain-smoking strong Turkish tobacco until the air was thick and acrid, staring at the patterns in the carpet as if they held some terrified secret. The first year after the war, 1871 leading into 1872, is often described by historians as the incubation period of his madness. But this clinical term fails to capture the visceral horror of what was happening inside Otto's mind. He was being eaten alive by memories he could not process and a reality he could not accept. The trauma of the battlefield, the sensory overload of death, had cracked the foundations of his psyche. And through those cracks, darker, more ancient fears began to seep in. His sleep pattern disintegrated completely. Insomnia became his constant, torturous companion. Servants stationed in the hallways of the residence reported chilling details that were whispered through the servants' quarters and eventually reached the ears of the king. They heard the prince pacing back and forth for hours. Mile after mile of carpet trodden in the dead of night. Sometimes the pacing would stop, replaced by a low guttural muttering. Otto was holding court with people who were not there. He was arguing with Prussian generals, pleading with dead comrades, or whispering frantically to his mother. Occasionally, a terrifying scream would shatter the silence of the palace wing, a raw, primal sound of pure panic that sent a shiver through anyone who heard it. When valets rushed in, They would find the prince cowering in a corner, sweating profusely, his eyes wide with terror, pointing a trembling finger at an empty chair or a shadow on the wall, screaming, "They are here! Do you not see them? The spies, the assassins!" The royal family, trapped in the rigid social codes of the 19th century, tried desperately to maintain a facade of normalcy. Mental illness was not viewed as a disease. It was a stain, a shameful weakness, a dynastic curse. This was particularly true for the House of Wittelsbach, a family that had long walked the fine line between genius and eccentricity. To admit that the heir presumptive, the future of the monarchy should Ludwig remain childless, was losing his mind was political suicide. It would signal to Prussia that Bavaria was weak, led by a line of degenerates unfit to rule. So, the official explanation was nervous exhaustion. The doctors prescribed rest, country air, and cold baths. They treated the symptoms of the body while the mind continued to rot. But the truth has a way of breaking down doors. The incident that finally shattered the wall of silence occurred on the Feast of Corpus Christi in 1872. This was not merely a religious holiday. In Catholic Munich, it was the supreme expression of national identity. The entire city shut down. The streets were lined with thousands of faithful. The procession was a river of color and incense, winding its way to the Frauenkirche, the massive twin-towered cathedral that served as the spiritual heart of the kingdom. Attendance at the High Mass was mandatory for the royal family. It was a moment of sacred theater where the king and his princes knelt before God, affirming the divine right that gave them their power. King Ludwig II, already struggling with his own aversion to crowds, was present, kneeling in the royal pew, resplendent in his uniform. The nave of the cathedral was packed with the highest nobility, the government ministers, the generals, and the wealthy burghers of Munich. The air was heavy with the scent of frankincense and the droning chant of the Latin liturgy. The atmosphere was one of solemn, hushed reverence. Then chaos struck. The heavy oak doors of the cathedral were thrown open with a violence that echoed through the stone vaults. Heads turned. A collective gasp rippled through the congregation. Standing in the doorway, silhouetted against the bright sunlight of the square, was Prince Otto. He was a shocking sight. He was not wearing the dress uniform required for such a solemn state occasion. He was not wearing the sash of the Order of St. Hubert. Instead, he was dressed in rough, dirty hunting clothes. He wore a coarse, loden jacket stained with mud. He wore heavy climbing breeches. And on his feet he wore enormous, mud-caked boots that clattered loudly on the stone floor. His hair was disheveled, his eyes wild and unfocused. For a moment he stood there, blinking in the gloom of the church, swaying slightly. The music faltered. The priests at the altar froze. Then Otto began to march. He strode down the center aisle, his heavy boots striking the flagstones with a rhythmic military cadence that cut through the silence. He looked neither left nor right. He did not seem to see the hundreds of shocked faces staring at him. He did not see his brother, the king, who had turned pale with horror in the royal box. Otto marched straight to the altar rail. He stopped abruptly, clicking his muddy heels together as if on a parade ground. He dropped to his knees with a thud that echoed in the vast space. He made the sign of the cross, not a pious, humble gesture, but a wide, exaggerated, almost theatrical slash of the hand through the air. Then, just as abruptly, he stood up, performed a sharp military about-face, and marched back down the aisle and out into the sunlight, leaving the door swinging in his wake. The silence that followed was absolute. It was the silence of a collective realization. This was not eccentricity. This was not nervous exhaustion. The prince was mad. The Corpus Christi incident forced the court's hand. The whispers could no longer be contained. King Ludwig II, deeply distressed and seeing in his brother a terrifying reflection of his own inner turmoil, authorized a formal medical intervention. The task fell to Dr. Bernhard von Guden, the director of the Munich district asylum and a man widely considered the foremost psychiatrist in southern Germany. Dr. von Guden was a complex figure, a man of science trying to bring light to the dark ages of mental health care. He was a pioneer of the no-restraint system, arguing against the chains and dungeons that had characterized asylum life for centuries. He believed in observation, routine, and moral management. Yet by modern standards, his methods were still crude and often cruel. He viewed mental illness primarily as a biological failure of the brain, a physical degradation of the nerves. His toolkit consisted of powerful sedatives like chloral hydrate to force sleep, hydrotherapy, and strict isolation to remove exciting influences. In the winter of 1873, Guden began his examination of the prince. It was a cat-and-mouse game. Otto, in his lucid moments, was intelligent, sharp-witted, and deeply suspicious of the doctor. He knew what Guden represented, a jailer in a white coat. He would often refuse to speak, staring at the doctor with a mixture of contempt and fear. Other times he would launch into articulate, furious tirades, accusing the doctor of being a Prussian spy sent by Bismarck to poison him. But Guden was patient. He observed the prince for weeks, noting the rapid mood swings, the hallucinations, the lack of personal hygiene, and the disintegration of logical thought. His diagnosis was grim. The terminology of the 19th century was imprecise. He used terms like primary insanity, dementia praecox, and melancholia. There were rumors whispered in the darkest corners of the court of syphilis, the French disease that ravaged the aristocracy of Europe. However, Guden's private notes lean more heavily towards a severe organic psychosis, likely triggered or massively exacerbated by the psychotropic trauma of the war. He concluded that the prince's brain was diseased and that the condition was progressive. The prescription was a sentence of life imprisonment, permanent removal from the court, strict medical supervision, and isolation from the public. In 1873, the transfer orders were signed. Otto was moved from his apartments in the Residenz to the southern pavilion of Nymphenburg Palace, located on the outskirts of Munich. It was a beautiful Baroque palace, the summer residence of the Wittelsbach, surrounded by vast manicured gardens and canals. But for Otto, the beauty was a mockery. The southern pavilion was converted into a high-class prison. The windows were fitted with reinforced glass. The doors were strengthened. A staff of male nurses, burly men chosen for their physical strength, rather than their medical knowledge, was assigned to watch him 24 hours a day. Life at Nymphenburg was a gray, suffocating routine. Otto's world shrank from the vast battlefields of France to a suite of 4 rooms. He was woken at a fixed hour. He was bathed, often against his will. He was forced to eat, and then he was left to the torment of his own mind. It was during these early years at Nymphenburg that the specific character of his madness solidified. He developed a profound phobia of doors. To Otto, a closed door was not just a barrier, it was a threat. He believed that terrible things were waiting on the other side: executioners, demons, or the Prussian police. He would stand for hours in front of a door, hand hovering over the handle, sweating and trembling, unable to summon the courage to turn it. Eventually, the doctors ordered the doors between his rooms removed or left permanently open to reduce his agitation. He also began to exhibit a heartbreaking form of regression. The man who had commanded a battalion began to play with toys. He would spend days arranging and rearranging small objects on a table, buttons, stones from the garden, pieces of paper. He would line them up in perfect military formation, inspecting them with the critical eye of a general. If a nurse moved one of the soldiers, Otto would fly into a rage, screaming that the formation had been broken and the flank was exposed. It was a tragic reenactment of the order he had lost, a desperate attempt to impose control on a world that had become chaotic and terrifying. King Ludwig's reaction to his brother's confinement was a mixture of grief, guilt, and existential dread. Ludwig stopped visiting frequently. He could not bear it. To look at Otto, disheveled, mumbling, staring at invisible enemies, was to look into a mirror of his own future. Ludwig was acutely aware of his own eccentricities, his own drift away from reality. He wrote in his diary of the shadow that hung over their house. He sent gifts, expensive wines, rare flowers, books, but he stayed away. The bond that had sustained them in childhood had been severed by the knife of insanity. Otto was alone. However, there was one final flickering moment of hope, or perhaps one final act of cruelty masked as hope. In August 1875, there was a lull in Otto's symptoms. For a few weeks, he seemed calmer. The hallucinations abated. He spoke clearly. He asked about current events. The doctors, perhaps eager to show progress to the king, or perhaps misjudging the cyclical nature of the illness, tentatively suggested a test. It was the feast of St. Ulrich. A military review was scheduled in Munich. The suggestion was made, let Prince Otto attend. Let him wear the uniform one more time. Let him see the troops. Perhaps the familiar structure of military ritual would anchor him, would remind his shattered mind of who he was. It was a gamble of immense proportions. On August 22, 1875, Prince Otto was dressed in the full dress uniform of a Bavarian general. He was groomed, his beard trimmed, his boots polished to a mirror shine. He looked for the first time in 3 years like a prince of the blood. He was driven in an open carriage to the parade grounds. At first it seemed to work. As the carriage rolled onto the field, the soldiers presented arms. The band struck up the Bavarian anthem. Otto sat straight, his hand raised in a salute. The old instinct took over. The crowd cheered, seeing their sunshine prince return to them. But as the review dragged on, the cracks began to reappear. The heat of the August sun was intense. The noise of the bands, the shouting of commands, the clattering of hooves, the sensory overload that had destroyed him at Worth and Sedan began to hammer at his fragile defenses. Eyewitnesses described the transformation. It was like watching a wax figure melt. Otto's posture collapsed. His salute wavered and fell. He began to tremble, a visible shuddering that shook the metals on his chest. His eyes, which had been clear, darted frantically around the field, seeing threats in the shifting formations of the cavalry. He began to claw at his collar, gasping for air as if he were choking. He started to mutter, low and fast, the old arguments with the voices, returning with a vengeance. The aide-de-camp sitting next to him signaled frantically to the driver. The carriage was turned around abruptly, cutting the inspection short. As they sped away from the parade ground, leaving the confused soldiers behind, Otto collapsed completely. He tore at his uniform, ripping the epaulets from his shoulders, sobbing uncontrollably. He was driven back to Nymphenburg, not as a prince returning home, but as a prisoner being returned to his cell. He would never appear in public again. The failure of the 1875 inspection was the final nail in the coffin of Otto's life as a human being. The doors of the world slammed shut forever. The doctors and the court officials accepted the reality. There was no cure. There was no hope. There was only management. The decision was made to move him to a place even more secure, even more isolated than Nymphenburg. Nymphenburg was too close to the city. The curious could still peer through the gates, and On quiet nights, the prince's screams could be heard by the gardeners. They needed a place where he could be completely erased. They chose Schloss Fürstenried. Located in a dense forest southwest of Munich, Fürstenried was a former hunting lodge built in the early 18th century. It was a sturdy, square building, isolated and imposing. It was perfect. The state poured money into renovations. They were not building a palace, they were building a gilded asylum. The walls were raised, the gardens were enclosed. The staff was vetted for loyalty and silence. In 1880, under the cover of darkness, Prince Otto was transferred to Fürstenried. As the carriage passed through the heavy iron gates and they clanged shut behind him, the first chapter of his life officially ended. The soldier, the brother, the prince, these identities were stripped away. He was now simply the patient. For the next 6 years, he lived in total obscurity. While Ludwig II was bankrupting the state building Neuschwanstein, Herrenchiemsee, and Linderhof, creating fairy tale worlds of stone and gold, Otto was creating his own worlds in the smoke-filled air of his room. He began to develop a new, terrifying routine. He would wake and demand his boots. He had developed a fetishistic obsession with footwear. He would order the servants to bring him every pair of boots in his wardrobe. He would spend hours inspecting them, smelling the leather, polishing them until the leather was thin. He would wear them on his hands. He would arrange them in circles and sit in the center, conversing with them as if they were his general staff. He stopped using utensils. He began to eat with his hands, tearing at meat like a starving animal, smearing food on his face and clothes. The fastidious, elegant prince was gone. In his place was a man who cared nothing for social norms. He let his beard grow wild and matted. He refused to bathe, fighting the attendants with the strength of a madman whenever they tried to force him into the tub. Yet amidst this degradation, there were flashes of the uncanny. He still possessed a terrifying memory. If an attendant quoted a line of poetry incorrectly, Otto, staring at the wall, would suddenly bark out the correct stanza in perfect German, then lapse back into silence. He retained a fluency in French and English, sometimes switching languages mid-sentence during his hallucinations. And he waited. He did not know what he was waiting for, but history was marching towards him. The year 1886 approached like a gathering storm. In the capital, the government's patience with King Ludwig II was breaking. The king's debt was astronomical. He was seeking loans from foreign powers. He was threatening to dismiss the cabinet. The Prime Minister, Johann von Lutz, decided that the time for sentiment was over. The king question had to be solved. Lutz looked at the Wittelsbach family tree. He saw a king who was allegedly mad and an heir presumptive who was undeniably mad. It was a constitutional nightmare. But Lutz was a pragmatist. He realized that a mad king locked in a palace was politically safer than a lucid king who spent millions and refused to rule. The plan to depose Ludwig was set in motion. Dr. Gudin, the keeper of Otto, was summoned to draft the medical report that would doom Ludwig. It is one of history's darkest ironies that the same doctor was used to condemn both brothers. Gudin did not need to examine Ludwig. He simply extrapolated from Otto's condition and the reports of spies. He declared the king paranoiac. On June 10, 1886, the commission arrived at Neuschwanstein. The trap was sprung, but deep in the forests of Fürstenried, Otto knew nothing of this. He did not know that his brother was being hunted in his own castle. He did not know that the crown of Bavaria, a burden that had crushed Ludwig, was hovering over his own head, ready to descend. On the night of June 12th, as Ludwig sat imprisoned in Berg Castle, awaiting his fate, Otto was likely pacing his room, the smoke from his pipe swirling around him, arguing with the ghosts of 1870. The two brothers, separated by miles and madness, were united in their tragedy. They were the last true kings of Bavaria, both broken by a world that had no place for them. The next day the sun rose on a Sunday, Whit Sunday, the day of the Holy Spirit. It would be the last day of Ludwig's life and the last day of Otto's existence as a mere prince. The waters of Lake Starnberg were calm and cold, waiting to receive their victim. And in Fürstenried, the phantom king was about to ascend his hollow throne, while the political assassination of Ludwig II reached its climax at Lake Starnberg. The walls of Fürstenried held Otto in a bubble of ignorance. He was about to become the central figure of a constitutional paradox, a monarch who possessed supreme authority but lacked the capacity to even understand his own name. The moment Ludwig died, the machinery of succession did not pause for grief or logic. It simply turned, dragging Otto from the darkness of the asylum into the blinding light of history. The dark waters of Lake Starnberg, which had swallowed the life of King Ludwig II on the evening of June 13, 1886, rippled outward with a consequence that no one in the Bavarian government was truly prepared to face. As the king's lifeless body was dragged onto the muddy shore, the clock of the Constitution did not stop. It ticked forward with a relentless, mechanical precision. In the eyes of the law, the moment Ludwig's heart ceased to beat, the crown did not fall to the ground. It floated spectral and heavy across the miles of forest and darkness, seeking the head of the next Wittelsbach male. It found its target in a padded room at Fürstenried Palace. The man who was now King Otto I of Bavaria was likely asleep when the burden of sovereignty settled upon him. Or perhaps he was awake, engaged in one of his nocturnal vigils, staring into the abyss of his own fractured mind. He did not know that his brother was dead. He did not know that the doctors who had been his jailers were now technically his subjects. He did not know that he was now the supreme warlord of the Bavarian army and the embodiment of the state. The transformation was instantaneous and absolute, yet it changed nothing about the locked doors, the barred windows, or the heavy smell of stale tobacco that clung to his clothes. The morning of June 14, 1886, broke over Munich with a sense of catastrophic unreality. The capital was paralyzed by shock. The king was dead. The circumstances were suspicious. Suicide, murder, an escape attempt gone wrong. Rumors flew through the beer halls and the markets like wildfire. But amidst the grief and the conspiracy theories, the machinery of the state had to function. The Prime Minister, Johann von Lutz, the architect of Ludwig's deposition, wasted no time. He could not afford a power vacuum. A proclamation was drafted immediately. It announced the death of Ludwig II, and in the same breath the accession of His Majesty, King Otto I. It was a proclamation of supreme hypocrisy. The government knew Otto was insane. They had legal documents proving it. They had locked him away for that very reason. Yet they now asked the people of Bavaria to swear allegiance to him. The army officers, the civil servants, the judges, all were required to take an oath of loyalty to a man who could not tie his own shoelaces without assistance. To formalize this surreal transition, a high-ranking delegation was dispatched to Fürstenried. It was a piece of theater that bordered on the macabre. The delegation, composed of somber ministers in black frock coats and top hats, arrived at the asylum palace. They were there to perform the ancient rite of informing the new monarch of his accession. We can only reconstruct the scene from the fragmented accounts of those present, accounts often scrubbed of their rawest details to preserve dignity. The delegation was led into the king's private quarters. They found Otto in a state of disarray. He was likely wearing his boots on his hands or rearranging his collection of small stones. The ministers bowed low. They addressed him as Your Majesty. They informed him with all the gravity of their office that his brother had passed and that he was now king. Otto's reaction was the final confirmation of the tragedy. He stared at them blankly. The words king and majesty seemed to trigger no recognition in his eyes. He did not weep for Ludwig. He did not straighten his posture. According to one report, he simply turned away, muttering about the spies in the corner, and returned to his obsessive counting. The delegation, embarrassed and horrified, bowed again to the madman's back and retreated. They had performed their duty. The legal fiction was complete. Bavaria had a king, but a king who cannot rule requires a keeper, and thus began the era of the Prince Regent. Prince Luitpold, Otto's uncle, was 75 years old. He was a man of the previous generation, a soldier, a hunter, a devout Catholic, and a staunch conservative. He had never sought the throne. He was content with his rifles and his country estates. But duty was the iron law of the Wittelsbachs. With Ludwig dead and Otto incapacitated, the burden of actual governance fell to him. Luitpold's position was delicate. He was not the king. He was merely the Verweser des Reichs, the administrator of the realm. He had to rule in Otto's name. Every law he signed, every decree he issued had to be prefaced with the phrase, "In the name of His Majesty the King." It was a constitutional masquerade that would last for a quarter of a century, and yet remarkably, it worked. The Prinzregentenzeit, the time of the Prince Regent, is remembered today by Bavarians not as a time of crisis, but as a golden age. After the dramatic, expensive volatility of Ludwig II, Luitpold offered stability. He was boring, predictable, and visible. He walked the streets of Munich without a bodyguard, smoking a cigar, tipping his hat to shopkeepers. He became a father figure to the nation. Under his regency, Munich blossomed into a cultural powerhouse of Europe, a center of Art Nouveau, science, and industry. The electric light came to the city. The tram lines expanded. The great museums were built. But this golden age was built on a foundation of silence. It was built on the erasure of King Otto. While Munich danced and modernized, time stopped at Fürstenried. The palace became a shadow court, a strange, hermetically sealed ecosystem designed solely to keep the king alive and hidden. The staff at Fürstenried were handpicked. They were sworn to absolute secrecy. To speak of the king's condition to an outsider was a crime punishable by immediate dismissal and potential imprisonment. Otto's life settled into a harrowing, repetitive rhythm that would endure for decades. He was the prisoner of his own routine. His day began early. His obsession with cleanliness, which had been so prominent in his youth, had vanished completely, replaced by a fear of water. Bathing the king became a military operation, requiring multiple strong attendants to restrain him while he screamed that they were trying to drown him. His fixation on boots intensified. It became the central pillar of his existence. He demanded new boots constantly. The palace accounts show exorbitant sums spent on footwear that was never worn outside. Otto would line them up, polish them, and sometimes wear them to bed. He would speak to them, seemingly assigning them personalities or ranks. To the psychiatrists of the time, this was meaningless fetishism. To a modern eye, perhaps it was a fragmented memory of his days as a commander. The boots representing the soldiers he had led into the mud of France, the only things he could still control. He smoked voraciously. His allowance for cigarettes and cigars was staggering. He smoked until his fingers were stained a deep, permanent yellow. He smoked until the air in his room was a blue fog. The nicotine likely acted as a form of self-medication, a way to dull the sharp edges of his anxiety. His meals were chaotic. He had lost the ability to use cutlery. He ate with his hands, tearing at meat, spilling soup down his front. The servants, trained in the etiquette of the royal court, had to watch their sovereign eat like a savage. Yet, they were instructed to treat him with the utmost deference. They bowed when they entered the room. They addressed him as Your Majesty. They set the table with the finest Nymphenburg porcelain, even though he would likely smash it in a fit of rage. These rages were terrifying. The apathy described in official reports was punctuated by storms of violence. Otto would suddenly become convinced that the walls were closing in, or that the food was poisoned. He would hurl furniture, attack the attendants, and smash the windows. The strength of the Wittelsbachs was still in him. In these moments, the no-restraint policy of Dr. Gooden was often abandoned. The King of Bavaria was physically restrained, held down by his own subjects until the sedatives took hold. Did he know he was king? The question haunted the few people allowed to see him. There were moments, fleeting, heartbreaking moments, where the fog seemed to lift. One recorded anecdote tells of a day when Otto heard the distant sound of a military band playing a march in a nearby village. The king stopped his pacing. He lifted his head. His eyes, usually dull and vacant, sharpened. He stood at attention. He began to hum the melody, tapping his foot in perfect time. For a minute, he was not the madman of Fürstenried. He was Lieutenant Otto, riding to war in 1866. Then the wind changed, the music faded, and he slumped back into his chair, the spark extinguished. Another story tells of a visit by his cousin, Prince Alphonse. Otto, usually unresponsive to visitors, stared at Alphonse's uniform. He reached out a trembling hand and touched the epaulets. "Prussia," he whispered. "Always Prussia." It was a glimpse into the trauma that still festered at the core of his madness, the deep, unhealed wound of the German unification that had cost him his soul. Outside the walls, the legend of King Otto took on a life of its own. The government could not show the reality, so they manufactured an image. Postcards were sold throughout the kingdom featuring the king's portrait. But they were not recent photos. They were images from the 1870s, heavily retouched. They showed a handsome bearded man in a general's uniform, looking serious and regal. The captions read, "Our beloved King." The Bavarian people, devoutly Catholic and deeply sentimental, embraced this tragic figure. They did not know about the screams or the filth. They imagined a melancholy king, a romantic figure suffering from a delicate sickness of the soul, pining for his dead brother. In the churches of the Tyrol and the Bavarian forest, peasants prayed every Sunday for the king's recovery. They felt a protective love for him. He was the Sorgenkind, the sorrow child of the nation. This sentimentality was politically useful for Prince Regent Luitpold. As long as Otto was the unfortunate king, Luitpold was the necessary guardian. The regency could continue indefinitely. There was no pressure to change the constitution, no pressure to declare a republic. Otto's suffering was the mortar that held the Bavarian monarchy together. Years turned into decades. The 19th century bled into the 20th. The world changed, unrecognizable. The automobile replaced the carriage. The telephone replaced the telegraph. The Wright brothers flew. The tensions in Europe began to ratchet up again, the alliances shifting towards the catastrophe of 1914. And still, Otto paced. He grew old in his cell. His hair turned white. His beard grew long and unkempt. His physical health, ironically, remained ironclad. While the sane members of his family succumbed to illness and age, the Mad King endured. He was a ghost who refused to fade. By 1900, a new generation of psychiatrists had arrived at Fürstenried. They were less optimistic than Gooden. They observed the king with a cold clinical detachment. Their reports from this period are devoid of hope. They describe a personality that had been completely hollowed out. The patient, they wrote, lives a purely vegetative existence. The hallucinations had become less active, replaced by a profound, impenetrable silence. He spoke less and less. He seemed to have run out of words. The relationship between the regent and the king remained distant. Luitpold visited rarely. It was too painful and perhaps too guilt-inducing. Luitpold was living the life that should have been Otto's. He was sitting on the throne, enjoying the adulation of the crowds, while his nephew rotted. Every year, on Otto's birthday and name day, the regent would issue a proclamation thanking the people for their prayers and expressing a hope for the king's health that everyone knew was a lie. But biology is the ultimate arbiter of politics. Prince Regent Luitpold was mortal. As the first decade of the 20th century closed, Luitpold moved into his 90s. He was the grand old man of Europe, the oldest ruling prince on the continent. But his frailty posed a terrifying question to the Bavarian establishment. What happens when the regent dies? The constitution was clear. If the regent died, the next in line would become regent. That would be Luitpold's son, Prince Ludwig. But Prince Ludwig was not like his father. He was not content to be a caretaker. He was 67 years old, an old man himself waiting for his inheritance. He had watched his father rule as a substitute for 25 years. He did not want to be a substitute, he wanted to be king. But he could not be king as long as Otto breathed. The king question began to simmer again in the corridors of the Munich residence. Lawyers began to whisper. Ministers began to consult constitutional texts. Was there a way out? Was there a way to end the charade? The Catholic Church was consulted. The Vatican was sounded out. Could the oath of allegiance to a madman be unmade? The people, however, remained fiercely loyal to the idea of Otto. To depose him would be seen as a cruelty, a betrayal of the helpless. The Shadow King had a grip on the popular imagination that the ambitious Prince Ludwig underestimated. In 1912, the inevitable happened. Prince Regent Luitpold developed bronchitis. His strength failed. On December 12, 1912, the pillar of Bavarian stability died. The funeral was a massive state event. Emperors and kings from across Europe came to pay their respects to the man who had kept the peace. But as the coffin was lowered into the crypt, all eyes turned to his son, the new Prince Regent Ludwig. Ludwig looked at the throne. It was empty, save for the invisible presence of the man in Fürstenried. Ludwig looked at the documents of state, still stamped with the signature Otto. He decided, then and there, that he would not live in a shadow. The regency had lasted 26 years. It had been a temporary measure that became a permanent institution. But the new regent was determined to break the deadlock. He initiated a quiet, ruthless campaign to change the constitution. He needed to prove that Otto was not just sick, but incurable. He needed to turn the tragedy of Fürstenried into a legal weapon. The final act of Otto's reign was about to begin. It would not be a revolution in the streets. It would be a revolution of lawyers and doctors, a coup d'etat carried out with fountain pens and medical certificates. The Ghost King was about to be exorcised. The death of the beloved Prince Regent Luitpold broke the spell that had held Bavaria in suspension for so long. The old man's passing removed the sentimental barrier that protected Otto's phantom reign. Now, a new, harder age was dawning, and the new regent, Ludwig, was a man who had no patience for ghosts. The time for management was over. The time for erasure had begun. The death of Prince Regent Luitpold in December 1912 was a seismic event that shook the foundations of the Bavarian Compromise. For a quarter of a century, the old man had been the glue holding the kingdom together. His white beard, his Tyrolean hats, and his grandfatherly demeanor had allowed the Bavarian people to suspend their disbelief. They could pretend that the king question was merely a tragic family matter, a temporary sorrow that God would eventually resolve. Luitpold was the benevolent steward, keeping the seat warm for whom? For a miracle recovery? For death? It was never spoken aloud, but with Luitpold in the crypt, the silence was broken. The man who stepped into the vacuum was Prince Ludwig, Luitpold's eldest son. He was 67 years old. In any other profession, he would be retiring. In the house of Wittelsbach, he was just starting his first day of work. Ludwig was a man of a different caliber than his father. Luitpold had been a man of the 19th century, romantic, feudal, content with the trappings of tradition. Ludwig was a man of the new century. He was an agricultural expert, a man who understood economics, canals, and crop rotation. He was pragmatic, arguably to a fault, and he was impatient. He had spent his entire life waiting. He had watched his cousin Ludwig II squander millions on castles, while the state treasury bled. He had watched his father rule as a subordinate for decades, bowing to the empty throne of a madman. Ludwig had no desire to be the second regent. He did not want to be a caretaker for a ghost. He wanted to be King Ludwig III. The atmosphere in Munich in early 1913 was fraught with a strange nervous energy. The city was booming. It was the cultural capital of the German South, a hive of avant-garde art, political radicalism, and industrial growth. Yet, at the very top of the social pyramid, there was a paralysis. The monarchy, the symbol of the state, was broken. The king was a locked-away lunatic. The ruler was a regent with limited powers. In a world that was rapidly arming for war, with the naval race between Britain and Germany accelerating and the Balkans on fire, Bavaria looked weak. Ludwig knew that to lead Bavaria effectively in the coming storm, he needed the full authority of the crown. He needed to be the supreme warlord, not just in practice, but in title. But standing between him and the throne was the specter of Fürstenried, King Otto I. The king question thus morphed overnight into the constitution question. It was a legal nightmare. The Bavarian Constitution of 1818, one of the most liberal in Germany, was explicit. The crown was hereditary. It passed by divine right to the eldest male heir. It was for life. There was absolutely no provision for deposing a king. A king could abdicate, certainly, but Otto was mentally incapable of abdicating. He could not legally sign his own name, let alone sign away his kingdom. This left the government in a trap. If they removed Otto, they were effectively staging a coup d'etat. They would be breaking the sacred line of succession. In a conservative Catholic kingdom where the monarch was seen as God's anointed, this was heresy. It would set a terrifying precedent. If a king could be removed because he was sick, could he be removed because he was unpopular? Or because he was politically inconvenient? It was the kind of Republican thinking that the Wittelsbachs had spent centuries fighting. Throughout the spring and summer of 1913, while the chestnut trees bloomed in the English garden and the beer gardens filled with happy crowds, a secret war was being waged in the smoky back rooms of the Munich residence. It was a war of lawyers, ministers, and princes. The prime mover was Baron Georg von Hertling, the chairman of the Council of Ministers. Hertling was a savvy political operator, a leader of the Catholic Center Party. He understood that the regency could not go on forever. He began to quietly sound out the mood of the parliament, the Landtag. He needed a consensus. If the deposition was to happen, it had to look like the will of the people, not a power grab by an ambitious prince. The arguments were fierce. The legitimists, the die-hard conservatives, were horrified. Better a mad king than a broken constitution, they argued. They pointed to the fact that Otto did no harm. He cost the state money, yes, but he did not interfere. Why destroy the sanctity of the crown for a title change? But the pragmatists countered with the reality of the age. We are living in dangerous times, they whispered. If war comes, can we really have an army that swears allegiance to a man who plays with stones? We need a king who can ride a horse, who can sign a mobilization order, who can look the Kaiser in the eye. Prince Regent Ludwig exerted immense pressure. He made it clear that he would not accept the constraints of the regency indefinitely. He wanted the civil list fully under his control. He wanted the prestige. It was a clash between the ancient mystical view of kingship and the modern functional view of the state. To break the deadlock, they needed evidence. They needed to prove, beyond any shadow of a legal doubt, that Otto was gone forever. They needed to prove that the man in Fürstenried was biologically alive but spiritually dead. In October 1913, a new medical commission was assembled. This was not like the commission of 1886 that had doomed Ludwig II based on hearsay. This commission had to be ironclad. It was composed of the most respected psychiatrists in the German Empire. Their mandate was chillingly simple. Go to Fürstenried, examine the king, tell us there is no hope. The scene of this final examination is one of the most pathetic in royal history. The doctors arrived at Fürstenried on a gray autumn day. The palace was silent, save for the wind in the surrounding forests. They were led through the security checkpoints, past the guards, who had spent their careers watching nothing happen. They entered the king's apartments. The air was stale, heavy with the smell of old tobacco smoke and unwashed bodies. They found King Otto in his usual chair. He was 65 years old now. The handsome youth of 1870 was unrecognizable. He was a ruin. His hair was long and white, his beard matted and stained with food. He wore a dressing gown that was spotted with ash. The doctors approached him. One can imagine the clinical detachment in their eyes, contrasting with the sheer human tragedy before them. They tried to engage him. "Your Majesty?" one doctor asked. Silence. Otto stared at his boots. He was rubbing the leather with his thumb over and over, a repetitive motion that had worn a groove in the material. "Do you know who we are?" Nothing. Not a flicker of recognition. They tried to test his reflexes. They tried to test his memory. They asked him about his brother. They asked him about the war. They asked him about his mother. Occasionally the king would mutter, but the words were a word salad, fragmented syllables, names from 40 years ago, commands to horses that had long since died. He was completely untethered from time and space. He was living in a loop of 1871, or perhaps in a world entirely of his own creation. The physical examination revealed the toll of his confinement. His muscles were atrophied from lack of proper exercise, though he still possessed a frantic, nervous strength when agitated. His skin was pale and papery, but his heart was strong. His lungs were clear. The cruel irony remained. His body refused to die. The doctors left the room, the heavy door locking behind them. They sat in the palace office and drafted their report. It was a death sentence for a reign. The language was stark, scientific, and devoid of sentiment. The patient suffers from a chronic secondary form of mental illness, advanced dementia, complete disintegration of the personality. The condition has persisted for over 30 years. There is absolutely no possibility of recovery or improvement. The incapacity is permanent. Armed with this document, Baron von Hertling went to the Landtag. The final act of the drama played out in the Bavarian Parliament in early November 1913. It was a somber affair. The representatives of the people knew they were about to do something unprecedented. They were about to rewrite the fundamental laws of the kingdom to accommodate the madness of a single man. The debate was surprisingly short. The medical report was read into the record. The silence in the chamber was profound. Even the staunchest legitimists could not argue with the clinical facts. Otto was not a king, he was a medical case. A compromise was struck. They would not simply depose Otto. That was too crude. Instead, they would amend the Constitution to create a legal mechanism for the future. The amendment stated, if a regency has lasted for 10 years, and if the king is incapacitated with no prospect of recovery as certified by medical experts, the regency may be terminated and the throne declared vacant. It was a law tailored for exactly one person. It was a retroactive justification for a coup. On November 4, 1913, the Landtag voted. The amendment passed with a sweeping majority. The Constitutional Council ratified it immediately. The next day, November 5, 1913, was a Wednesday. It was a damp, foggy day in Munich. At the residence, Prince Regent Ludwig signed the decree terminating the regency. Then, in a separate document, he declared the throne vacant. And finally, in a third document, he proclaimed his accession to the throne. The bells of the Frauenkirche began to toll. The flags were raised. The heralds read the proclamation in the Odeonsplatz. Long live King Ludwig III. The crowd cheered. There was relief. Finally, a real king. Finally, an end to the ambiguity. The nightmare of the Shadow King was officially over. But in the rush to crown the new king, there was a nagging sense of guilt. What of the old king? What of the man who had done nothing wrong but lose his mind? Ludwig III, perhaps sensing the unease of his subjects, made a gesture of extraordinary compassion, or perhaps extraordinary strangeness. He issued a decree stating that Otto would not be stripped of his royal dignity. He would not become Prince Otto again. He would remain His Majesty King Otto. Bavaria, uniquely in history, now had two living kings. One reigned in the residence, wielding the scepter and the pen. The other reigned in Fürstenried, wielding a polished boot and a phantom army. The news of his deposition traveled the short distance from Munich to Fürstenried by telephone. The administrator of the palace received the call. He was told that his charge was no longer the sovereign. The staff were now servants of King Ludwig III. Did anyone tell Otto? It is one of the most haunting questions of the entire saga. Historical consensus suggests that the doctors and attendants likely made no formal announcement to him. What would be the point? To explain to a man who didn't know he was king that he was no longer king would be an exercise in futility. However, there is a legend, perhaps apocryphal, perhaps true, that on the day of the deposition, the routine at Fürstenried shifted slightly. The guards, perhaps confused by the change in status, relaxed their protocol. Maybe a door was left unlocked for a moment longer than usual. Maybe the deference in the servants' voices slipped just a fraction. One story claims that Otto, sensing a disturbance in the ether, became unusually agitated on November 5th. He paced his room with renewed fury. He stopped in front of a portrait of his father, Maximilian II, which hung on the wall. He stared at it for a long time, muttering, "They have taken it. They have taken the light." Was he speaking of the crown? Or was he speaking of the tobacco pouch he had misplaced? We will never know. For the world outside, the deposition of Otto was a footnote in a much larger, darker narrative that was unfolding. The year 1913 was the last year of the Old World. The long 19th century was dying. The optimism of the Belle Epoque was curdling into fear. While Ludwig III busied himself with the duties of state, opening agricultural fairs, reviewing the troops, meeting with the Kaiser, Otto remained in his time capsule. But the isolation of Fürstenried could not completely block out the tremors of the earth. As 1914 dawned, the tension in Europe reached a breaking point. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo in June 1914 set the dominoes falling. The alliance systems that Otto had seen forged in blood in 1870 dragged the continent into the abyss once more. In August 1914, the war that Otto had dreaded, the war that had broken his mind 40 years earlier, finally arrived. Germany declared war on Russia, then on France. The mobilization orders were posted. The trains filled with soldiers singing patriotic songs, convinced they would be home by Christmas. King Ludwig III, now the supreme commander, declared war in the name of Bavaria. He sent the youth of the kingdom, the sons and grandsons of the men Otto had led, into the meat grinder of the Western Front. At Fürstenried, the impact of the war was felt not in bombs, but in absence. Many of the male nurses and attendants who had cared for Otto for years were reservists. They were called up. They traded their white coats for field gray uniforms. They said goodbye to the Mad King and marched off to die in Flanders and the Somme. Otto was left with a skeleton staff. The younger, stronger men were replaced by older retainers. The quality of his care likely dipped. The food became scarcer as rationing bit into the German economy. The luxury of the royal asylum began to fray at the edges. Did the sound of the trains reach him? Did the distant booming of the celebratory cannons in Munich register? There is a profound tragic symmetry in Otto's timeline. His sanity died in the First German War of Unification in 1870. His body would die in the Second German War of Destruction in 1914 to 1918. He was the alpha and the omega of the German Empire's tragedy. He saw its birth in the Hall of Mirrors, and he lived just long enough to see it commit suicide in the trenches. Throughout 1915, as the stalemate on the Western Front turned into a slaughter, Otto's condition began to change physically. The manic energy that had sustained him for decades began to ebb. The pacing slowed. The shouting matches with the walls became whispers. He spent more time sitting, staring out of the reinforced windows at the leaves turning color in the garden. He was a relic, a living fossil of a time when kings were absolute and wars were fought by gentlemen in bright uniforms. Now gas was drifting over Ypres, and machine guns were mowing down thousands in an afternoon. The world had become madder than Otto ever was. In the churches of Munich, the prayers for King Otto ceased, replaced by desperate prayers for our sons at the front. The Ghost King was forgotten, eclipsed by the millions of ghosts being created every day on the battlefields of Europe. He had been the Sorgenkind of the nation, but now the whole nation was a child of sorrow. But the final curtain had not yet fallen. The Ghost King had one last duty to perform, to die. With the outbreak of the First World War, the world finally caught up to the nightmare that Otto had been living in for decades. The chaos he had fled into, the sanctuary of madness, was now the daily reality for millions of men across Europe. As the continent tore itself apart, the forgotten king in Fürstenried began to fade, his own internal war nearing its quiet, inevitable armistice. The autumn of 1916 was a season of dying. Across the damp, cratered fields of the Somme and Verdun, a generation of European youth was being systematically erased by artillery and machine gun fire. The death notices in the Munich newspapers were no longer individual listings. They were long, dense columns of names that stretched from the top of the page to the bottom, a daily ledger of grief that touched every hamlet in Bavaria. In this atmosphere of overwhelming national mourning, the impending end of an old locked-away man in a forest palace seemed almost insignificant. King Otto I had survived the trauma of the Franco-Prussian War, the humiliation of his diagnosis, the deposition of his brother, the death of his uncle, and the stripping of his own crown. He had outlived his relevance, his dynasty's stability, and his own mind, but he could not outlive the frailty of the human body. In early October 1916, the routine at Fürstenried Palace was disrupted not by a tantrum or a hallucination, but by a sudden, alarming silence. The king, who for years had been a creature of restless energy, pacing his rooms until the floorboards groaned, stopped moving. He refused his food. He curled onto his bed, drawing his knees to his chest in a fetal position that spoke of deep, instinctive distress. The attendants, now mostly older men, who had been with him for decades, recognized the signs of physical collapse. The doctors were summoned immediately. Their diagnosis was swift and grave: a volvulus, a twisting of the intestine causing a blockage. It is an excruciatingly painful condition, a torture that would have made a sane man scream for mercy. Yet the reports indicate that Otto bore it with a terrifying stoic quietness. Perhaps his mind, already so detached from the sensory world, could no longer process pain in a way that could be communicated. Or perhaps after 40 years of mental anguish, physical pain was a language he simply no longer spoke. The medical interventions of 1916 could do little for a 68-year-old man in his condition. Surgery was deemed too risky. The shock would kill him instantly. So the decision was made to make him comfortable. Morphine was administered, softening the edges of the agony. The shadows in the room grew longer. The voices in the walls, his constant companions for half a century, surely began to fade as the sedatives took hold. On October 11, 1916, the end came. It was a Wednesday, much like the day he had been deposed 3 years earlier. Outside, the leaves of the Bavarian forest were turning the color of blood and rust. Inside the darkened room at Fürstenried, the breathing of the ghost king grew shallow, then ragged, and finally ceased. There were no last words. There was no moment of lucidity where the clouds parted and the sunshine prince returned to say goodbye. There was only the stopping of a heart that had beaten for too long in a world that had no place for it. King Otto I of Bavaria, the longest reigning monarch of the Wittelsbach dynasty in the modern era, despite never having ruled for a single day, was dead. The news was telephoned to the residence in Munich. King Ludwig III received the message with a complex mix of emotions. Relief, certainly, that the living reminder of the family's tragedy was at peace, but also perhaps a chill of foreboding. Otto had been the lightning rod for the dynasty's misfortunes. With him gone, the protection of the unfortunate label was removed. Now the monarchy had to stand on its own merits in a world that was rapidly losing patience with kings. The funeral of King Otto stood in stark, depressing contrast to the magnificent operatic farewell that had been given to his brother Ludwig II 30 years earlier. When Ludwig died, the peasantry had lined the roads, weeping and wailing, throwing flowers onto the hearse. It had been a national trauma. But for Otto, the nation was too exhausted to weep. His body was brought from Fürstenried to the capital in a black hearse drawn by horses that looked lean from the wartime rationing. The procession through the streets of Munich was somber and hurried. There were no brass bands playing Wagner. There were no cheering crowds. The people who stopped to watch the cortege pass took off their hats in respectful silence. but their eyes were hollow. They were thinking of their sons in the trenches, not the old man in the box. He was taken to St. Michael's Church, the massive Renaissance Jesuit church in the city center. This was the traditional resting place of the Wittelsbachs. He was carried down into the royal crypt, a cold vaulted space smelling of incense and damp stone. There, in the gloom, the final reunion took place. Otto's coffin was placed next to that of Ludwig II. The two brothers, who had played together as boys in the alpine meadows of Hohenschwangau, who had shared the burden of a terrifyingly strict father and a distant mother, and who had both been crushed by the weight of a crown they were ill-equipped to wear, were together again. Ludwig, the dreamer who drowned in his own myths, and Otto, the soldier who was shattered by reality. Two sides of the same tragic coin, finally at rest in the dark. But history has a cruel sense of timing. Otto's death seemed to break the final seal on the fate of the Kingdom of Bavaria. It was as if his lingering existence had been a strange talisman, holding back the collapse. Just 2 years after Otto was lowered into the crypt, the German Empire disintegrated. The war was lost. The hunger and the grief that had stalked the streets during Otto's funeral exploded into anger. In November 1918, a revolution swept through Munich. It was led not by Prussian generals, but by tired soldiers and workers, the very men Otto had worried about in his letters from the front in 1870. King Ludwig III, the man who had schemed so meticulously to depose Otto and claim the throne, found himself suddenly powerless. He did not even have the dignity of a formal abdication. He was forced to flee Munich in the dead of night, escaping his own palace in a car that drove through the foggy fields, vanishing into exile. The House of Wittelsbach, which had ruled Bavaria for 738 years, one of the oldest dynasties in Europe, fell in a matter of hours. The irony is devastating. Otto, the incapable one, the mad one, had technically reigned over the golden age of the kingdom, a period of peace and cultural flourishing, preserved by the stability of the regency. Ludwig III, the sane one, the capable one, reigned for only 5 years, and in that time he oversaw a catastrophic war, the death of thousands of his subjects, and the total destruction of his inheritance. It begs the question, who was truly the madman? The prince locking himself in a room to polish boots, or the king sending millions of men to walk into machine gun fire for the sake of national pride? In the century that has passed since his death, King Otto has largely faded from the popular imagination. Tourists flock to Neuschwanstein by the millions to buy mugs with Ludwig II's face on them. They watch movies about the Swan King. They listen to Wagner and think of the lonely monarch in the mountains. Otto has no monuments. Fürsten Ried Palace is not a museum. It remains a retreat house and is largely closed to the public. There are no statues of him in the squares of Munich. He left behind no great buildings, no operas, no diaries of philosophical longing. He left behind only a signature stamp and a stack of medical reports. But his story is perhaps the more poignant one, for it is the story of the collateral damage of history. Otto serves as a terrifying mirror to the era that created him. He was a sensitive young man born into a role that demanded hardness. He was a soldier who could not stomach the slaughter of war. He was a human being who cracked under the pressure of being a symbol. His life forces us to confront the uncomfortable reality of how society handles those who do not fit. We see the evolution of psychiatry, from the cruel moral management of the 19th century to the cold warehousing approach of the early 20th. We see how a family, terrified of scandal, chose to bury their son alive rather than admit to his vulnerability. We see how a government, desperate for continuity, was willing to use a mentally ill man as a puppet prop for decades, stripping him of his dignity to maintain the illusion of order. In the end, the image that lingers is not the official portrait of the bearded king in his general's uniform. It is the image of the old man in the smoke-filled room at Fürstenried. It is the image of Otto holding a pair of boots, speaking to them softly in the twilight, trying to find order in the chaos. He was the king who wasn't there, but his absence was loud. It echoed through the halls of the residence. It echoed through the battlefields of France, and it echoes still in the crypt of St. Michael's. It is the silence of a soul that was sacrificed on the altar of the state, a reminder that behind every golden crown and every grand historical narrative, there is a human cost, often hidden, often locked away, but never truly forgotten. The tragedy of Otto is the tragedy of the hollow crown. It is the story of a man who was given everything the world values, power, titles, wealth, and yet possessed nothing, not even his own mind. And in his silent, terrified solitude, he may have been the only one who truly understood the madness of the world around him. As the earth settled over Otto's grave, one might expect the story to end, but the life and death of the Ghost King left scars on the Bavarian psyche that would not heal so easily. To fully grasp the meaning of Otto's tragedy, we must look beyond the biography and into the pathology of a dynasty and a nation. We must ask the difficult questions about what truly destroyed his mind, and how the fall of one broken man presaged the fall of an entire kingdom. The silence that descended upon the crypt of St. Michael's Church in October 1916 marked the end of King Otto's physical suffering, but it was not the end of his story. In the grand narrative of history, the death of a protagonist often triggers a ripple effect, a series of aftershocks that reveal the true structural damage done to the world they left behind. For the Kingdom of Bavaria, the removal of the Ghost King did not heal the nation's wounds. Rather, it exposed the rotting foundations of the monarchy itself. To fully understand the magnitude of this tragedy, we must step away from the chronological narrative and enter the realm of historical pathology and political consequence. We must examine the why and the what if. We must look at the Wittelsbach curse, the medical mystery that still divides historians, and the catastrophic collapse of 1918 that was in many ways the final legacy of the empty throne. The most persistent rumor whispered in the courts of Europe and still debated in internet forums today is the specter of syphilis. In the 1800s, syphilis was the secret killer of the aristocracy. It was incurable, sexually transmitted, and in its tertiary stage, neurosyphilis, it caused symptoms that mimic profound mental illness, grandiose delusions, paralysis, mood swings, and dementia. We know that Otto, in his wild years between the wars of 1866 and 1870, lived a libertine lifestyle. He frequented the salons and arguably the brothels of Munich and Paris. It is a convenient theory. It adds a layer of moral tragedy to the story. The prince punished for his sins. However, modern analysis of the surviving medical records from Fürstenried casts significant doubt on this theory. Neurosyphilis typically kills its victims within a few years of the onset of mental symptoms. It causes a rapid physical degeneration, a general paralysis of the insane. Otto lived for 45 years after his first symptoms appeared. He remained physically robust, retaining his strength and his reflexes until the very end. He did not suffer the characteristic tremors or the Argyll-Robertson pupil associated with the disease. If not syphilis, then what? The weight of evidence points to a virulent form of paranoid schizophrenia. likely possessing a strong genetic component triggered by the extreme psychotropic trauma of combat. We cannot ignore the bloodline. The House of Wittelsbach, for all its brilliance in art and architecture, was a family genetically besieged. Inbreeding, practiced for centuries to secure alliances and territories, had concentrated certain vulnerabilities. Otto's aunt, Princess Alexandra of Bavaria, suffered from a famous delusion that she had swallowed a glass piano as a child and had to walk carefully to avoid shattering it inside her. His brother Ludwig II built castles in the air to escape a reality he could not touch. But Otto's madness was different from Ludwig's. Ludwig was eccentric and avoidant. Otto was shattered. Modern psychiatrists who have reviewed Dr. Gooden's notes point to the classic symptoms of what we now call post-traumatic stress disorder with psychotic features. The timeline is damning. Otto was a functional, happy young man until he saw the carnage of the Austro-Prussian War. He held it together until the horrors of the Franco-Prussian War and the humiliation of Versailles. In 1871, the term shell shock did not exist. There was no vocabulary for the psychological injury of war. A prince who screamed in his sleep was not seen as a casualty of battle. He was seen as weak or defective. It is highly probable that Otto's initial breakdown was a severe stress response that, left untreated and exacerbated by the primitive isolation therapies of the time, spiraled into a permanent psychotic break. The tragedy here is not just medical, it is the tragedy of missed understanding. Had Otto been born in 2025, he might have been treated with therapy and medication. He might have lived a full life. Instead, he was locked in a room and told to stare at the wall. The madness of King Otto was as much a creation of 19th century ignorance as it was a biological fact. If Otto's illness was the crack in the vase, the revolution of 1918 was the hammer that shattered it. When Otto died in 1916, the Bavarian monarchy lost its mystical sufferer. King Ludwig III, the man who had deposed him, was now the sole focus of the people's attention, and the people were starving. The Allied naval blockade was strangling Germany. In Munich, the turnip winter had reduced the population to eating fodder usually reserved for cattle. The beer halls, once the centers of jovial loyalty to the crown, became cauldrons of sedition. Ludwig III was a decent man, an agricultural reformer, who wanted to feed his people, but he lacked the charisma of Ludwig II and the tragic sympathy of Otto. To the angry workers and the disillusioned soldiers returning from the front, he was just an old man in a uniform, a representative of the system that had sent them to the slaughter. The memory of Otto played a subtle psychological role in this unraveling. For 30 years, the monarchy had been a hidden thing, a bureaucracy running in the name of a phantom. The people had learned to live without a king who was present. They had learned that the state could function even if the monarch was locked away. This eroded the idea of the indispensable king. If Bavaria could survive Otto, did it really need Ludwig III? Did it need a king at all? On November 7, 1918, the end came with shocking speed. A massive peace demonstration was held on the Theresienwiese, the grounds of the Oktoberfest. It was led by Kurt Eisner, a Jewish journalist and theater critic with a wild gray beard and a mesmerizing speaking voice. Eisner did not have an army. He had a mob of tired soldiers and hungry workers. He marched them from the fairgrounds into the city. They walked past the barracks. The royal guards, sworn to protect the king with their lives, simply refused to shoot. They lowered their rifles. Some even joined the march. It was the final verdict on the Wittelsbachs. The army which Otto had loved so much, which he had polished his boots for every day in his asylum, had abandoned the dynasty. That night, King Ludwig III sat in the residence. He was told that the revolution was at the gates. He asked for the army. "The army is gone, Your Majesty," he was told. The king, the queen, and their daughters packed a few bags. They walked out the back door of the palace. They found a car. They drove out of Munich into the foggy night, their headlights cutting through the darkness of a kingdom that was no longer theirs. The car skidded into a potato field. The king of Bavaria, the heir of 800 years of history, had to stand in the mud and wait for help. At that very moment, in the Mathaserbräu beer hall, Kurt Eisner stood on a chair and declared Bavaria a free state, a republic. The dynasty was dead, and in the crypt of St. Michael's, one can imagine the ghosts of Ludwig and Otto watching the collapse with a grim sense of inevitability. The hollow crown that Otto had worn for 27 years had finally been crushed. Even in death, the mystery of Otto's mind remains a subject of debate. For decades, whispers in European courts suggested syphilis, the secret killer of the aristocracy. Yet modern analysis of the medical records points to a different tragedy, a virulent form of paranoid schizophrenia, likely triggered by the immense trauma